The screen lights up and you feel strangely smaller than before. Every notification contains a promise and a demand wrapped together, and most people answer almost automatically. This is the lost hour, the subtle trade-off where attention becomes currency and identity becomes content. We begin with a simple question that feels urgent and intimate. What does it mean to be authentic when our lives are permissions and profiles and curated highlights? Authenticity sounds like a moral high ground, but it is also a fragile practice. The internet amplifies signals and flattens context, so private struggles become public streams that invite constant judgment and editing. We will explore how this amplification shapes identity and why the feeling of being oneself can be so elusive online. This narrative will move between philosophy, research, and stories because ideas become alive when connected to lived experience. By the end of this exploration, we will have concrete ways to recognize performance and foster true connection instead. To begin, we have to understand what authenticity actually means in practice. Authenticity is not a fixed trait, but a networked practice of aligning actions, values, and relationships over time. Online life challenges that alignment by turning moments into signals and signals into reputations before they become relationships, when every post can be liked, shared, and archived. People begin to perform for attention rather than participate in conversation. Performance becomes tempting because it is measurable, and measurable things quickly replace subtler forms of meaning. Performance and connection are not the same, even when they look similar on the surface. A performed life seeks approval and metrics, while a connected life seeks resonance and mutual understanding across time. The difference matters because attention paid is not the same as presence felt, and the brain registers those two experiences differently. When we act for approval, we optimize behavior for variables other people can measure and algorithms can amplify. When we act for connection, we sacrifice short-term performance advantages for deeper relational returns. Social media invites curation, and curation often becomes a performance of idealized identity. People edit their lives into narratives that attract validation instead of truth, and that editing creates distance between who they are and how they appear. Over time, this distance becomes a structural force that pushes people toward consistent performance rather than spontaneous authenticity. That structural force is reinforced by feedback loops where likes, comments, and shares reward certain expressions while neglecting others. Algorithms act like invisible audiences that silently coach us into predictable behaviors. Philosophy offers frameworks to diagnose why this gap between appearance and being feels so corrosive. Stoicism, existentialism, and pragmatism each give us different tools for thinking about reputation and selfhood online. The Stoics, in particular, had surprisingly modern insights about fame, reputation, and inner freedom that translate directly to digital life. Stoic philosophers argued that reputation is external and largely outside individual control, and therefore it should not govern inner tranquility. Applying that idea to social media suggests a radical shift. Our peace can depend less on public metrics and more on internal principles. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that people are made for cooperation and mutual aid, not for endless public performance. His focus on duty and character suggests that one should measure actions by virtue rather than applause. In the age of social platforms, this means practicing values publicly when necessary, but not confusing applause with moral worth. Stoicism instructs us to distinguish between things we can control and things we cannot control, a distinction that becomes crucial on social media. Understanding control helps prevent the obsessive pursuit of approval that social networks are designed to provoke. Comparison and envy are the twin engines that drive a lot of online discomfort. When feeds curate success and happiness without context, viewers are left to infer causes and then compare themselves unfavorably. That comparison is often false because it treats highlights as wholes and ignores the invisible labor behind those highlights. Psychology shows that upward social comparison reduces well-being and increases envy, and social platforms make upward comparisons constant and unavoidable. The solution is not to quit platforms entirely for most people, but to learn practices that reduce comparison and increase grounded perspective. One useful philosophical reframing comes from existential thinking about authenticity and freedom. Existentialists emphasized the responsibility of choosing one's own values rather than adopting others' scripts. Online, that reframing invites us to ask why we post, who we are trying to please, and whether those goals align with our deeper commitments. When posting becomes an act of self-definition rather than mere performance, the content changes in tone, frequency, and impact. Intentional posting converts social media into a reflective tool for expression rather than a reflexive tool for approval. Practical strategies exist that bridge philosophy and everyday behavior on platforms. The first strategy is to practice small experiments in transparency that prioritize truth over polish, and those experiments should be repeatable and low risk. The second strategy is to cultivate selective audiences and routines that protect vulnerability instead of exposing it indiscriminately. These strategies are not about perfection, but about training a muscle that responds to audience pressures with principled decisions. Over time, those habits build a consistent character that people recognize as trustworthy rather than performative. Another powerful practice is the slow post rule, where one waits before publishing content that triggers strong emotion. This delay creates space for reflection, reduces reactive performance, and increases the likelihood of sharing things aligned with values. Many regrettable posts are born from immediate emotional reactions that would look different after a short pause. Slow posting also allows for context to be added, which prevents misinterpretation and reduces the performative impulse. It is a small temporal adjustment with outsized effects on perceived authenticity. We should also consider the architecture of platforms and how it nudges behavior in certain directions. Design choices like infinite scroll, highlight reels, and reward notifications prioritize engagement metrics over depth of interaction. Recognizing these influences restores agency because people can then choose platforms and features that align better with their values. Some platforms are optimized for fleeting attention, while others encourage deeper exchanges through long-form content or community features. Choosing the right environment is a philosophical act of aligning tech use with personal commitments. Community matters more than followers when it comes to genuine connection. A few meaningful relationships that sustain vulnerability will contribute more to well-being than thousands of distant admirers. Investment in reciprocal relationships creates a feedback loop of trust that outlives temporary metrics and viral moments. Cultivating those relationships requires intentionality in choosing whom to invest time with and how to reciprocate support. Social media can amplify those investments if used to deepen, not replace, existing bonds. Balancing online and offline life is less about rigid boundaries and more about integrated practices that honor both spheres. Offline experiences provide the depth and nuance that online interactions often lack, and those experiences become content only when they are genuinely lived. Prioritizing face-to-face interactions means treating social media as an occasional amplifier rather than the primary stage for life. Practical balance looks like scheduled tech-free times, intentional in-person gatherings, and digital fasting rituals that reset attention. These habits preserve the relational capital that social platforms can never fully replicate. Reputation management can become a healthy practice when guided by internal values rather than external validation. The Stoic emphasis on virtuous action helps reorient reputation as a byproduct of consistent choices instead of a goal. Acting in ways you would be proud to be remembered for creates a public persona that is authentic because it is grounded in private conviction. This orientation requires courage because it sometimes invites misunderstanding and slower recognition. Yet, over time, persistent character tends to produce deeper respect than ephemeral popularity. Envy can be redirected into curiosity and learning when we examine the structures behind success. Instead of assuming innate superiority in others, ask what constraints, trade-offs, or choices produced visible outcomes. That inquiry reduces emotional reactivity and increases practical knowledge about what is possible and what is affordable. Turning envy into curiosity transforms comparison from a threat into an instrument for growth. When we learn from others without diminishing ourselves, social media becomes a resource instead of a poison. Intention is one of the most underused tools on social platforms because it requires premeditation and practice. Setting explicit intentions for why you post, who you want to reach, and how you want to feel afterward creates a metric beyond likes. That metric can be emotional alignment, mutual benefit, or truthfulness rather than simple engagement numbers. Writing down intentions before logging in or posting can dramatically improve alignment between values and actions. Small rituals anchor behavior and prevent the unconscious drift into performative patterns. There are design practices individuals can adopt that reduce the platform's coercive influence. Curating your feeds, muting accounts that trigger comparison, and using time-limiting tools are all acts of self-governance. These small interface choices compound into significant differences in emotional landscape and attention ecology. Applying philosophical scrutiny to these choices turns passive consumption into active shaping of experience. The form of your attention matters because attention shapes character over time. Authenticity online does not mean total transparency or radical honesty without context. Authenticity requires discernment about what to share and when, recognizing that boundaries are a form of integrity. Real authenticity includes caring for others' well-being and for your own privacy, not merely emptying everything onto a feed. Healthy boundaries allow trust to grow because they indicate respect for complexity and potential consequences. Why sharing is a practice that protects both vulnerability and dignity in digital spaces. Stories matter because they shape how we interpret both ourselves and others on social platforms. Narratives that emphasize struggle, learning, and continuity invite empathy more than narratives that only showcase success. When people tell stories with complexity, it signals a willingness to be known rather than consumed. Encouraging narrative depth might mean posting about process instead of product, or about doubt instead of certainty. Those choices create a richer public culture where authenticity can survive algorithmic pressure. Philosophy gives us a vocabulary to discuss these shifts without moral panic or naive optimism. Concepts like control, virtue, and authenticity help translate abstract concerns into actionable habits. The history of thought shows that technological change always stresses social forms, but human practices can adapt through reflection and communal effort. This adaptation is not guaranteed, but it is possible when individuals take responsibility for aligning their online behavior with enduring values. The work is both personal cultivation and civic practice. In the end, authenticity online is a continuous project that combines reflection, habits, and community. It is not a destination or a one-time revelation, but an ongoing conversation between who you are and how you choose to show up. The internet will continue to change, but how we relate to it depends on long-standing human practices of honesty and courage. If this exploration gave you a new lens, remember that philosophy is less about abstract answers and more about better questions to live by. Practice small experiments in alignment, protect relational depth, and treat your online presence as a practice rather than a performance. Now, a final philosophical twist brings this discussion into modern relevance and personal agency. Authenticity online ultimately becomes about the traces you leave and the communities you cultivate, rather than about temporary approval metrics. If we regard social media as a new kind of public square, then our responsibility extends to the quality of discourse and the resilience of relationships we help create. This is a hopeful conclusion because it suggests individual actions compound into cultural norms over time, and each small choice nudges collective practice in a direction that values truthfulness and depth. If this perspective shifted something for you, consider trying one small intention experiment this week and observe the results. Remember, living authentically online is as much a moral discipline as a technical skill. The virtues of patience, courage, and clarity matter in digital contexts, just as much as in physical ones, and practicing those virtues changes the shape of online lives. If enough people adopt this orientation, platforms will be pressured to reward depth rather than just speed of attention. So try one small thing, post with intention, pause before sharing, and choose presence over performance when possible. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join the conversation for more ideas about living well in a connected world.